A nation's dawn, dreams of freedom. South Sudan, the world's youngest nation, was born on July 9, 2011. It was a day of jubilation, a day of hope. After decades of brutal conflict with Sudan, independence promised a brighter future. A future free from oppression. A future where South Sudanese could chart their own destiny. The world watched, cautiously optimistic. Could this fledgling nation overcome its troubled past? Could it build a peaceful and prosperous future for its people? The challenges were immense, but the spirit of independence burned bright. The euphoria, however, was short-lived. Just 2 years later, the dream of a peaceful South Sudan lay shattered. The descent into chaos, civil war, erupts. In December 2013, the nation plunged into a brutal civil war. Political rivalries, ethnic tensions, and power struggles ignited a conflict that would engulf the young nation. What began as a political dispute between President Salva Kiir and his former deputy, Riek Machar, quickly escalated into a full-blown ethnic conflict. The Dinka, Kiir's tribe, and the Nuer, Machar's tribe, were pitted against each other. The violence was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Millions were displaced. The country spiraled into chaos and despair. A glimmer of hope. The 2018 peace agreement. After years of devastating conflict, a glimmer of hope emerged in 2018. Kiir and Machar signed a revitalized peace agreement. The agreement, known as the RRCS, aimed to end the violence and pave the way for a unity government. There was cautious optimism. Could this be the breakthrough South Sudan desperately needed? Could this agreement finally bring an end to the suffering? The international community welcomed the deal, but the path to peace proved treacherous. Implementation was slow, key provisions were delayed, and the violence, though reduced, never fully ceased. Stalled progress, political instability, and delayed elections. The peace agreement's fragility became increasingly apparent. Political instability persisted. The formation of a unity government was delayed, and trust between the warring parties remained elusive. Elections, initially scheduled for 2022, were postponed. The necessary steps for a credible and peaceful electoral process were not in place. The delay raised concerns about the commitment to a democratic transition. The international community expressed growing frustration. The slow pace of reforms, the lack of political will, and the continued human rights violations raised doubts about the government's commitment to peace. Lucky enough to receive them were eroded by inflation. The economic crisis exacerbated an already dire humanitarian situation. Millions of South Sudanese were pushed into poverty. Food insecurity became widespread. The nation teetered on the brink of collapse. Section 6. A humanitarian catastrophe, hunger, displacement and suffering. The combination of conflict, economic collapse and climate change created a humanitarian catastrophe in South Sudan. Millions faced severe food shortages. Malnutrition rates soared, particularly among children. The United Nations warned of famine-like conditions. Hospitals were overwhelmed with malnourished children. Families were forced to flee their homes in search of food and water. The situation was desperate. The influx of refugees from neighboring Sudan, fleeing the renewed conflict there, further strained South Sudan's limited resources. The humanitarian response was overwhelmed. The scale of the suffering was immense. Section 7. The cycle of violence, human rights abuses and impunity. Despite the peace agreement, violence continued to plague South Sudan. Localized conflicts, often fueled by ethnic tensions and competition for resources, resulted in widespread human rights abuses. Civilians bore the brunt of the violence. Killings, sexual violence, and displacement continued with impunity. The culture of impunity emboldened perpetrators and perpetuated the cycle of violence. The government's efforts to address human rights abuses were inadequate. Justice and accountability remained elusive. The lack of progress fueled resentment and undermined reconciliation efforts. Section 8. External shocks, climate change and aid challenges. As if conflict and economic collapse were not enough, South Sudan also faced the devastating impacts of climate change. Years of severe flooding displaced communities, destroyed crops, and exacerbated food insecurity. The floods also increased the spread of diseases like cholera and malaria. The country's fragile infrastructure was ill-equipped to cope with the recurring disasters. The climate crisis compounded the humanitarian emergency. Humanitarian organizations struggled to provide aid in this challenging environment. Insecurity, bureaucratic obstacles, and funding shortfalls hampered their efforts. Despite their best efforts, the needs of the South Sudanese people far outweighed the available resources. Section 9. A future uncertain international response and potential scenarios. The international community, once optimistic about South Sudan's future, grew increasingly critical of the slow progress and continued violence. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway, known as the Troika, expressed their frustration. They called for genuine commitment to peace, accountability for human rights abuses, and an end to corruption. But their leverage seemed limited. South Sudan's leaders appeared more interested in consolidating power than in building a peaceful and prosperous future. The future of South Sudan remains uncertain. Will the country be able to break free from the cycle of violence and poverty? Or will it continue to be plagued by conflict, corruption, and humanitarian crises? The answer lies in the hands of its leaders and people. The international community can play a supporting role, but ultimately, it is up to the South Sudanese to decide their own destiny. The world can only hope that they choose peace.